cunning was actually considered a complimentary word. It doesn't have the sort of low cunning feel that cunning has now. It meant that they were clever, that they could do all sorts of things that other people couldn't.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we are so excited to talk about A Cunning Man's Grimoire with internationally acclaimed author, practicing magician, and scholar, Dr. Stephen Skinner. Now, listeners, before we dive into anything and everything related to A Cunning Man's Grimoire, I would definitely encourage you to check out Dr. Skinner's previous appearances on the podcast if you haven't already. He's written more than 46 books, translated into more than 20 different languages. He received his PhD in classics from the University of Newcastle for his research on the Greek text of the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri and a number of Latin grimoires. But in this episode, Dr. Skinner shares about A Cunning Man's Grimoire, the secret of Secrets, which is a grimoire presented by both Dr. Skinner and David Rankine. Now, this tome is a historical grimoire that features a fascinating blend of high magic and local village magic. Originally, it was a handbook for a working sorcerer, and it includes a wealth of magical workings, in addition to a treasure trove of critical astrological information, including a unique set of astrological tables that are usually absent from other grimoires. Now, Dr. Skinner shares about the transmission of A Cunning Man's Grimoire and why he was hesitant at first of even publishing this text at all. He answers some listener questions. He talks about the differences and similarities between so-called high magic and so-called cunning man's magic. He also talks about how astrological magic and Solomonic or ceremonial magic come from two distinct historical strains, although there is some overlap, and he talks about so much more. And now, returning to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Dr. Stephen Skinner. Dr. Stephen Skinner, thank you so much, as always, for taking the time and coming back on the podcast again.
It's good to be chatting with you again.
Can you just give us a little background on this text in terms of how you initially became interested in this and just kind of the whole genesis of this project?
Well, I suppose going back a little bit further, my rationale is to bring works of practical magic out of the darkness of libraries and into a form they can be read, because believe me, reading some of the old manuscripts is hard work. And this is something I've been doing now for, 10, 15, 20 years. It's a matter of choosing a good one or choosing one that was interesting. And the reason why I chose The Cunning Man's Grimoire is because it had a mixture of different sorts of magic in it. It's almost like a notebook of a practicing magician who put in it the things that he needed to know, the essences, the shortcuts, things like that. This is not like the grimoires that I've done before. That's why I chose this particular book. Yeah, apart from that, the fact is that the history was there. A guy called Thomas Hearn worked out its history, and he tracked through 5 or 6 different owners. It started with a guy called Thomas Allen, 1540 to 1632. And Thomas Allen was a pretty well-connected magician. He knew Sir Robert Cotton, he knew Sir Cullen Digby, and he knew the Wizard Earl Henry Percy, the 9th Earl of Northumberland. And he did some little jobs for them, magically and politically. He also knew Dee and Harriet and various other, Sir Philip Sidney and so forth. I was fascinated by the fact that he produced the base material for this. And then it passed from hand to hand, and each time it passed, something would have been added, something would have been deleted. Although I couldn't exactly see what had happened at each change of ownership, I figured out pretty much which years who owned it and what they might have done with it. Immediately after Thomas Allen, who was really more of a scholar and a high magic grimoire specialist, it came to a cunning man called Old Cornelius. Now, cunning men who used village magic, and that's just a convenient term rather than a very suitable one, would have provided services to his neighbors in the village or the immediate surrounding. He would have done astrology for them. He would find items that had been stolen. He would look for a potential wife or husband. Some of the female cunning women would also act as midwives and so forth. So he was a hands-on magician. And when he died, his daughter sold the manuscript to another cunning man, simply called Old Stockford, because we don't know what his first name was or indeed even his date of birth. We know when he died, 1683, and he was more interested in the astrological side of magic. So he inserted into the grimoire an ephemeris and used it in the grimoire to explain what he was doing and also to help himself to work out what were the right times for doing particular rituals. And then from Old Stockford, it passed into the hands of Moses Long. Now, a lot of people have written about Moses Long, and they say, oh, he was from Gloucestershire. It's not actually true. He was from Gloucester Hall in Oxford, because in fact, almost every owner of this grimoire lived in Oxford or thereabouts. And from Moses Long, who wrote his name in the manuscript, so I can be absolutely sure he owned it at some stage, it passed to Thomas Hearne. Sadly, Moses Long scribbled out a lot of stuff in the front of the manuscript, which would have been useful to find out. And Thomas Hearne was a very conscientious scholar and clergyman, and he figured out the history that I've just told you. When he died, he bequeathed it to William Bedford. William Bedford's widow sold it to Richard Rawlinson. Richard Rawlinson finally donated it to the Bodleian Library, which is where it resides now, and where indeed I found it. That's a bit about its background.
Wow. How does this line of transmission compare to the line of transmission, Dr. Skinner, that you might find in other grimoires? In other words, in England, around the 18th century, the 17th century, was this a pretty common thing for these books to change hands so many times? I'm thinking of a lot of the Dr. Rudd manuscripts being part of kind of a 17th century English angel magician group. I mean, is this a common thing?
Yeah, because there were not very many printed books about magic. I think the first big printed book with magical methods in was printed around about the mid-1600s. But before that, everything was manuscripts. And manuscripts are precious because they took time to write. And each one is unique. One of the problems with magic is that having been rewritten many, many times, things get lost and things get corrupted. One of the beauties of it being manuscript is that people then tend to preserve it, and it usually finishes up in a library. You get somebody like Rawlinson. He gave his collection of 5,200 books and stacks of manuscripts to the Bodleian, and they preserved it since. So I spent quite a bit of time looking through their catalogues and working actually in the Duke Humphrey Library in the Bodleian. I don't think you can work in there anymore, but it's a beautiful old classical library where the benches are wood, the books are immediately in front of the benches, and many of the more precious ones are actually chained up so that people cannot run off with them. And when I first went there, they asked me to swear on a Bible that I wouldn't steal anything, that I wouldn't use lit candles in the library, and that I wouldn't mark any of the manuscripts with a pen, pencil, or brush. I don't know whether they still do that, but it was that's a long time ago. It was quite a quaint introduction to the Bodleian.
Just as an aside, Dr. Skinner, you've obviously, have a stellar reputation, and you've translated and edited dozens of books. Have you ever, in your travels, had to swear on a Bible that you wouldn't take anything before, or?
No, it's only the Bodleian. The Bodleian did it, and they preserved lots of these old customs. I haven't been very recently, and I think they've actually moved out of the Duke Humphrey Library. I think Duke Humphrey Library was actually used as the set for Harry Potter, as a Harry Potter library. Really it didn't need any alteration. They just filmed it as it was. But since then, I think they've moved the main reading room somewhere else, but I'm not sure. But reading there was quite a pleasure because you felt as if you were actually in the 16th century. You looked up at the ceiling, and the ceiling had various heraldic crests painted on it. You looked along they're not dusty shelves, but they could have been. It was very quiet. And originally, when I first read there, they had catalogue cards, and thumbing through those, there was a lot of information in there which didn't seem to make it into the electronic catalogues. So I've got notes that I made from the catalogue cards of manuscripts which don't appear to be in the electronic catalogue. But anyway, that's a minor gripe. So, no other library has ever asked that of me. Libraries regularly just leave your bag outside and carry your stuff in clear plastic so we can see you're not. Oh, one incident in the manuscript room in the British Library. I have a very old notebook which I've been working on and revising and crossing out and so forth for, I won't tell you how many decades, but a very long time. And as I was walking out with that notebook, they pulled me on one side and said, "You can't, what's that?" And it took me a long time. I said, "Well, look, my name's inside it." "Oh, you might have written your name inside it," because it looked so old and so tatty. They thought it might have been one of their precious manuscripts. Eventually, I persuaded them that no, it was my precious manuscript and not theirs.
At least good that they're doing due diligence, but there might have been a little bit too much in that case.
Oh, yeah. I'm in favor of due diligence.
Absolutely. Can you kind of just lay out the broad differences between high magic versus village magic? And is there a difference between village magic and so-called cunning man magic? Just what would you like the listeners to know? Okay, so first of all, high magic and village magic are just relative terms because it's not as clear-cut as all that. At one level, you've got people who use traditional grimoires like the Key of Solomon or the Megaton and do the whole ritual and each step and so forth. And these operations take quite a long time to do. And I would just label that as high magic. But I could also label it as conscientious magic or as traditional grimoire magic. Now, these magicians passed stuff around, and some of it finished up in the hands of cunning men. Cunning was actually considered a complimentary word. It doesn't have the sort of low cunning feel that cunning has now. It meant that they were clever, that they could do all sorts of things that other people couldn't. There were cunning men operating in Essex as late as the early 1900s, and for all I know, more recently than that. The cunning man was much more goal-orientated. He was going to get a fee, and he didn't want to, he was going to do his job as quickly as possible, and so he would use shortcuts or abridged formula to get the work done. And one of the things about the Cunning Man's Grimoire is it has a number of very short little operations in there. Some of them are too short and so truncated that they in fact won't work. That's really the difference. The cunning man would work for clients, whereas the aristocratic high magician, if you like, would really probably be working for himself and for close friends and so forth. So Thomas Allen, he was aristocratic. All of his contacts were in that area. And so this book has passed from him down through 3 cunning men, and then Thomas Hearn, he was a very thorough academic, and then Bedford, who was a doctor, Rawlinson, who was a book collector, and finally to the Bodleian. So this is a fascinating cross-section. I've experienced village magic also in Asia. So I lived for a while in Johor, and down the road there was a dentist, or a Dr. Gigi as they call them here. And then a couple of offices, if you like, further on, there was a tablet on the door, and it said magic in Chinese. It had several sigils that I recognized, and it also said it in Bahasa. And so it was very clear what this guy was. And he was a magician for hire. And I did get to know him, and he was quite good at what he did. But he didn't go through the whole long, I'll call it rigmarole.
but he had his little shortcuts, and he also had his spirits, and so he'd already invoked spirits, bound them, and they were available almost immediately. And I have to say, I caught sight of a couple out of the corner of my eye, or at least I thought I did, and then these did the things he needed to do pretty fast, and people who paid him seldom went back to complain or ask for a refund. That happened a few times, but very seldom. So he was an Asian cunning man, because these things still work in Asia. You still have magicians. You still have people understand that magic is a thing that works. Whereas in the West, there's this huge layer of skepticism over the top of it. Well, first of all, there were a couple of centuries, or more than a couple, of persecution, which made it very dangerous. With the Enlightenment and the incoming of materialism, people just disregarded magic. One of the reasons I like living in Asia is that it's people are much more open and happy to talk about it and things here. In fact, one of the things we were talking about, Alexander, earlier, was Isaac Newton, that he is sometimes seen as one of the early physicists and mathematicians, but in fact, one biography of him referred to him as the last magician. He was deeply into alchemy and magic and prophecy, biblical interpretation, and the number of papers and things involved with that are much greater than the number of papers that were on mathematics or physics. So he was a bit of a universal man, working on both sides of the spectrum. But that kind of acceptance doesn't happen anymore. So when his papers came up for sale, John Maynard Keynes bought all his mathematics and his physics and donated them to one or two of the university libraries in the UK, and failed to bid on the manuscripts on alchemy and magic. Well, luckily, one guy who was more into this, a guy called Abraham Sholem Yehuda, who I'll talk about more later, he bought all of these manuscripts, so they're still intact and still preserved.
I think you had a quote on Facebook that you publicly posted a few months back, but to your point about living in Asia, I think you mentioned something that people often ask you why you are so interested in two seemingly unrelated things, magic and feng shui. And I think you kind of summed it up beautifully, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you said that these two things are tools, they are technologies that you can use so that instead of being anxious about something or wondering if something can work out in life, you can actually do something about it. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yeah, they're proactive. Magic is about making changes. Feng shui is about making changes. Now, sadly, feng shui has been dumbed down in the West, so it's become a sort of subset of interior decorating, and it's not that kind of feng shui that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the kind of feng shui where people who practice it are well-paid and well-respected professionals, and they will go to a home or a business, and the homeowner or the business owner will say, you know, these are the things I want. I want my son to succeed in school. I want my business turnover to increase, etc., etc. And then he will set about making the changes for those to happen. Now, in the West, it doesn't really work because you tell a client what changes they should make, and usually they don't make them, and then they say, oh, it didn't work. So I much more prefer working with feng shui in Asia itself, where everybody understands what it's about.
When I was interviewing John King and talking about imperial arts and kind of his own take on his workings with the Goetia system years ago, he mentioned that a lot of people tend to get in this kind of armchair mode, and I'm totally paraphrasing him here, where they are just obsessed with another edition of something or a newly discovered manuscript, all very, very important. But his point was, well, if you're going to use magic, what are you actually going to use it for? You have to have a larger plan. You have to have a goal. And I guess my question would be, to John's point, Dr. Skinner, how often do you see that? I mean, with people who you might see in the online forums or people who might ask you questions, is there kind of a hesitancy to jump in and just do it, and people are more interested on the academic side? Or can you just share your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, there are a lot of armchair magicians out there. I can't complain because they buy my books, but I would prefer that they actually use them. I don't know whether it's a fear of failure or even fear of success, but I think the usual thing is, I just need to know one or two more things before I start. I just need to do this, I just need to do that. It's like if people are interested in gardening, after they bought a few gardening books, they'll buy plants. If they're interested in cooking, they'll go into the kitchen and start working on it. But somehow magic seems to generate a lot of procrastination. I was lucky because I started in my teens and I just put everything together, did it as thoroughly as possible, and I had success. So I didn't need to stop and think, what else do I need? And I've been building on that ever since. You need to figure out what you want, what your objectives are. You don't have to be doing it every day or every week. It's there to solve problems or create things.
Absolutely. And of course, I think myself and so many listeners out there have fallen into that trap where you go, let me just ask one more question, because if I can figure out exactly how to consecrate this tool, then that will give me the edge and this and that. But then I think that, at least from my own experience, and I think this is what you're saying, Dr. Skinner, is you learn so much more via the felt presence of direct experience just by stepping in the circle and doing it.
Absolutely. I mean, people hypothesize spirits this and spirits that and so forth, but nothing beats actually talking to the spirit to find out exactly what it is that they want or they like, rather than endlessly hypothesizing about it. And I sometimes have people who tell me, spirits do this and spirits do that. And I ask, did you actually talk to them or did you actually invoke them? Oh, no, but spirits are like this or like that. And spirits, in fact, are not like what most people think they are. People who worry about things going wrong shouldn't, as long as they've done it properly. And there's plenty of text out there to do it properly. And Keep Solomon is quite thorough in what you need. As long as you have done the circle properly, and you have a phylactery or a layman, and you do the procedures correctly, then, that's it. You can't get into too much trouble. Anyway, so I encourage you to actually do it. On the other hand, of course, thinking about magic is quite fun, and reading lots of books and so forth is also good stuff. But if you don't need anything, then maybe there's no need to actually do it. But I did like what John King said, particularly about the relationship between the magician and spirits. And I won't go into that again, but he said some really quite smart things.
To that point, Dr. Skinner, one of the things John did mention, and it's something that I really didn't think about before, and I just love your thoughts on it, is he talks about fulfilling the terms and how exactly, as you mentioned, you fulfill terms by executing certain procedures and certain consecrated tools. The spirit then fulfills their terms. But he also talked about, even after the rite is completed, that if the magician is still able to hold to those terms, then all is well. But that if the magician just does things after the rite, that, behaving erratically, breaking vows. I mean, there were a few examples that John kind of hinted at, but have you found that too, Dr. Skinner, that after the procedure, if the magician or the client is not fulfilling their end of the bargain, can that affect things?
Yeah, the thing that people don't understand is that vows and oaths are much more serious than just telling a girlfriend, I'll see you at 6 o'clock tonight. If I'm late, well, that's too bad. When you're dealing with spirits, you need to make sure that what you say is what you're going to do. Because after all, you want them to do what they say. And John actually hinted at the long-term implications of a relationship with a spirit. He did that rather subtly. I don't want to go there at the moment. But people who just think, I'll do this for a thrill, or I'll just do half of what it says in the book. Fortunately, they'll be mostly protected by the thing not working. But you've got to do it correctly. And then I noticed some questions about, can you mix and match various things? And my answer to that is no. You should do exactly by the book until you know what you're doing. You cannot mix and match stuff that you don't know. It's like, I'm not particularly good at cooking, but I certainly wouldn't stir plaster of Paris into my cake mix or do something like that. But people think, oh, well, I'll just drag this bit of practice from here and that bit from there. It's not going to work, or it's going to have a problem, or you're going to have a problem. I'm aware of some practitioners who think that it's not necessary to have a circle, that they can just visualize it, or I think in some cases just project it on the ground. No, it's got to be a solid piece of protection. The layman has got to be consecrated. Then it's okay. You've got to do it properly.
You know, to that point, Dr. Skinner, when we're talking about a Cunning Man's Grimoire, the secret of secrets, there's a question from Dr. Al Cummins that he had where he says, I'd be curious for Dr. Skinner's take on how a Cunning Man's Grimoire and other grimoires use this kind of pick and mixing method from other systems. So, for example, in a Cunning Man's Grimoire, there's astrology, there's more village magic spells, but yet then there's an entire section of the Heptamer that is copied out, all for, as you said at the beginning, to develop their own synthesis of an effective magical system. So I guess pick and mixing, are there advantages to that, limitations?
Well, no, there are limitations. I was a bit dubious about publishing this one. I think I said I delayed it for quite a while because it might encourage people to pick and mix. If you're a cunning man, then you've got the time to do it and so forth. No, you've got to establish your connections with the spirits first. Once you've got that, then you'll get feedback from them, so you'll know what you really can and can't do beyond that. Just to take it without any clue at all is the equivalent of using engine oil and plaster of Paris in your cake mix. Don't do it.
Right, right.
What was the other thing that you mentioned that Dr. Cummins mentioned?
When you go through the grimoire, a Cunning Man's Grimoire, it has, astrological spells. It has village magic,
Okay, so let me pull back from there and define what the basic forms of Western magic are. Now, I'm not talking about Indian magic or African magic or anything else. I'm talking about magic as it's been used in Europe or in Egypt or around the Mediterranean, basically. There are two strands, and these are different because of their cultural background, they're different because of their method, and they're different because of the way you do them. One is the evocation, invocation, or as I prefer to call it, the Solomonic method, which is fairly clearly laid out in most of the books that I've written. Now, for timing, that relies upon planetary hours and planetary days, and also the moon phases. But that really is enough. You don't need complicated astrology. This strand comes from Egypt through Greek culture to Latin and into Europe. Now, a completely different strand is the one that comes from Arabic sources, and will include things like the Picatrix. And it is involved in image magic and the creation of talismans. And these talismans are made at very specific times under very specific astrological combinations. You don't have the same, it's just a completely different system. I don't want to elaborate on that. But these two shouldn't be pick and mixed. Now, they are pick and mixed slightly in the Cunning Man's Grimoire because it's got stuff from the Heptamer. The Heptamer is strictly Solomonic, regardless of what anybody says, it's Solomonic magic. But it's also got fairly complicated astrological calculations, which have been drawn in from the other tradition. So I would just say that those are not completely necessary for Solomonic magic, but they are useful for talisman making.
Absolutely. And you say on page 15 here, and I just want to make sure that I'm getting this right, that the 28 mansions of the moon, for example, belong to that different magical tradition which owes its origins to the Arabic and Indian roots rather than to the Greek roots of Solomonic magic. So would it be fair to say, Dr. Skinner, that, as you mentioned, the Heptamer, for example, is strictly a Solomonic, even though it has the names of Arabic jinn kings like Maimon and other things of Saturn and Varkon or Barkon Rex, that it really is derived from that Solomonic method?
Yeah, the method is the same. If you're talking about names, then you're talking about particular spirits or spiritual creatures, and they can be called in different ways. So this is where the slight confusion happens there. But the method is Solomonic. But the 28 mansions of the moon are really for specific talisman creation or image magic. And the two things have overlapped historically, but it's not a good idea to overlap them in your practice, I don't think.
To that point, Dr. Skinner, there's a question we had from an anonymous listener who said, I would be curious to hear Dr. Skinner discuss how the order in which you call the names in the Heptameron section, the author for this section really details, even in greater detail than the Heptameron itself, the proper order for calling these angels. And they would be curious to hear, Dr. Skinner, if you could explain that about even more detail in this Cunning Man's Grimoire.
Well, as a general rule, magic relies upon hierarchies. The sequence of calling in any magical operation, but particularly in Solomonic, is to start with the Godhead. And this is where, for example, John Dee would be praying. Move down from there to the archangelic, then to the angelic, and then using particular thwarting angels, constrain spirits. Now, that will immediately cause a reaction in some of my listeners who will say, thwarting angels, oh, that only goes back to about the 1600s. But that's not true. It's a long-term part of magical practice to use one name to constrain a spirit below it on the hierarchy. I know nowadays it's very popular to say everybody's equal, but in the spiritual world there is a very strict pecking order. So you can use, for example, the 4 demon kings to constrain the demons in their legions. Or you can use an angel to constrain the demon that corresponds to that angel. But you need to have authority. Now, as puny humans, you can't go and say, do this, do that. You need to actually get the okay from somewhere higher up in the scale. That's where the sequence of calling comes in. Going back to thwarting angels, which has become a bit of a topic online, the first very clear grimoire that uses that is the Testament of Solomon, which is a 2nd century grimoire. And it's very clear in matching particular angels with particular demons. And those matchings still work today.
In the Heptameron, for example, and I haven't seen this in too many other Western grimoires, for each day of the week it lists, instead of the demon kings of the 4 directions, for each day it lists angels or spirits of the north, south, east, and west. I mean, what role do they have in the hierarchy? You know, should they be called first before everything else? Do they play the role or kind of substitute for the 4 kings of the directions? What's that all about?
Well, for example, say for Tuesday, the angel will be Samael or Satael or Amabiel, and under them will be the angels of the air and their king, which is Samax. And then Samax in turn has 3 ministers, so we're going down the scale now. And then underneath the ministers there will be individual spirits, and there will be different spirits in the east from those in the west and from those in the north. Magic is very directional. It's the old joke, you need to face the direction from which the spirit is coming, otherwise he'll be upset at seeing your back rather than your front. And so Heptameron is particularly directional. Even more than that, the circle which you use isn't a one-size-fits-all, but the circle will be different for each day of the week, and it'll be different for each season, and it'll be different for which direction you're invoking in. I quite like that because it's very detailed, and you can then just do it by the book. The labor involved, though, in producing a new circle each time is considerable, whereas, for example, with the Goetia, you've got just one circle, and that works for all.
Thank you for elucidating that, because I think so many listeners talk about that, you know, like, well, what role does this play in the hierarchy, especially with the Heptameron? It's such a as you mentioned, it's such an interesting text. I mean, part of it derives from the Jewish, Sefer HaRazim with the seven heavens, but then you have these Arabic kind of jinn kings, as you said, Maimon Rex and Varkon Rex. So it just seems like it draws from different traditions, but your focus is really, regardless of the tradition, it comes down to the method. Is this a Solomonic method, or is this some other method? Would that be somewhat fair?
Yes, but I would also say that spirits and demons and angels have an individual existence. So Maimon Rex may have originally come from Arabia, but he's still accessible via Heptamer invocation performed in London or Vienna or whatever else. A lot of the angels in there, because of their EL endings, are obviously also from Hebrew sources.
And to that point, Dr. Skinner, and I believe we were talking about this before the interview, but on page, I think it was 105 of A Cunning Man's Grimoire, we do have a question from Morgan Marquez, who is asking, my question has to do, for Dr. Skinner, with the description of the ways the subtle vapors of incense and fumigation operate strongly, quote, upon the air and also upon our breath, found in A Cunning Man's Grimoire in the fumigations and incense section. This part, she says, made me lean in because I have never heard this idea of how incense influences the spirits, the magician, and the environment articulated so beautifully. I would love to hear Dr. Skinner talk about this idea of the 6 different levels, and I believe meaning those different ways that the incense has this effect. And I'm curious as to from what source texts or manuscripts our Cunning Man might have pulled this idea of the multiple ways that incense can influence. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, answering in reverse order, I don't know what source he pulled it from, because most of the practical grimoires have something about what they call suffumigations. In other words, the incenses. Incense is definitely one of the necessary ingredients in an evocation. Incenses like frankincense actually also have a physiological effect on people. If you burn really pure frankincense, there's a definite mind shift on that. But it also has a very strong effect on the spirits. Spirits are attracted by beautiful smells, but for them, it's the specific smell that is associated with their particular planet that's important. So, for example, frankincense is basically good for solar spirits. But if you wanted to have Venusian spirits, then you might use spikenard. Spikenard does not work very well on solar spirits, and so on. The division of the incenses according to the planets is quite important. On the other end of the scale, if you use stinky things, they tend to drive spirits away, which is quite interesting. One of the classical stories of evocation was written by a guy called Benvenuto Cellini. And Cellini was a superb craftsman in gold and silver, and he made some of the most beautiful gold and silver cups and chalices and things that are still in museums now. I don't think there are very many of them in private collections because they cost a fortune. But he was into magic, and so he got, I think it was an Italian magician, to do an evocation, and they did it in the Colosseum in Rome. I mean, you can't just walk in there and do evocations now, but apparently in those days you could. When the magician was successful in calling not one or two, but hordes of spirits, he got all of it out of hand. And so Cellini was told, put the stinky stuff on the brazier quickly. We need to put the bad smells to drive the spirits away because they were getting out of hand, which he duly did. It took a long time to work before they had closed down the operation. But it's one of the most interesting descriptions of an evocation, or indeed an evocation that went wrong. But it explains the principle that the beautiful smells that are planetary appropriate to the spiritual calling actually help to bring the spirits. And it's like if you're on a date and you're wearing cologne, or if you're a girl and you're wearing perfume, it does help to attract the other party. Spirits are not quite like that, but the right incenses will actually attract them, so this helps. it gives them an environment that they can survive in. And stinky incense had the reverse. So in the Cunning Man's Grimoire, it says that suffumigations, which is what they call incenses, proper to the stars, are of great force and virtue for receiving celestial gifts under the rays of the stars, which is long form for saying will encourage the spirits to do what you're asking. The incenses work strongly on the air and also on our own breath. Now, one of the other conditions before doing a successful ritual is that you should be clean physically. Almost all of the grimoires say that the magicians and the assistants should have a full bath beforehand so that none of the usual human smells are perceivable by the spirits. In fact, some of the grimoires say that the magician should rub his body with a sweet-smelling incense as well, which is quite good, because the spirits don't like bad smells. It's also the rationale behind not eating garlic. In Greco-Egyptian, you don't eat garlic before you enter a temple or before you do a ritual, because the bad breath smell actually drives away the spirits. So the incense works on us as well as the spirit and on the surrounding air. And it says that perfumes procure spirits presently to appear and to cause them later to depart. So, although Mather said that it was the smoke which causes and enables the spirit to appear, I don't actually believe that's true. The spirit will appear without masses and masses of smoke, but the process is helped along by sweet-smelling incenses.
Dr. Skinner, thank you for that elucidation. And to that point, I know there's a lot of debate online about evocation to physical or full manifestation. I was talking with John King about this. Where do you come down on that in terms of, like, incense, for example? Is it that the spirits use that in a physical way that kind of anchors them to this reality, as Dr. Joseph Lasuski kind of intimates, or is evocation to physical, meaning audible or visual manifestation, necessary every time, or can one simply issue a charge if they're confident that the spirit's bound without those signs? I mean, where do you kind of weigh in on that?
That's a key question, but I can answer that in terms of practical experience. One of my very early operations, which I think I shared with you, was done in a sound studio with very efficient air conditioning. The air conditioning sucked all of the incense out, so the smell was left, but virtually no smoke was left. That was successful. Now, the main question, though, is, do you need visible appearance? Well, you don't, but it's good to get a visible appearance perhaps for the first or second time, or at the time you bind the spirit. That is also useful, but you can still work if you I won't say have the feeling that the spirit's present. You can then tell it what you want it to do and what the conditions are and what you will do or give it in exchange. Even an accidental request can sometimes be fulfilled. So, for example, I talked on one of your previous programs about an accidental request which resulted in Alice Bailey books.
Oh, yes.
Well, that spirit never manifested physically. That request wasn't one we wanted. It was said with the most conviction at the high point of the operation. And it worked. And it worked at the physical level. The station wagon pulled up, absolutely crammed with boxes of every conceivable edition of Alice Bailey's work. And the man driving it had no idea why he'd come, and he was going to insist upon leaving it there. And in the end, he just loaded it onto the pavement outside and drove off. Now, that is definitely the spirit. There's no way in the world that was a coincidence or anything like that. And so I can say clearly that physical manifestation is not necessary, but it is useful. It's also useful for the magician's confidence in his work. If he's seen the spirit or at least heard the spirit, this is much better. I came across somebody recently who I know quite well, who did an operation for one of the servitors of one of the Indian goddesses, and she asked the servitor, "What is your name?" Because that's one of the key things with spirits. If you know their name, you have some control over them. At that question, there was a huge commotion outside in the neighboring lane. And she didn't get an answer. And later she asked the same question, and there was another huge commotion outside in what's otherwise a very quiet area. So you're getting physical results from things like this. There was no visible materialization. It didn't result in the answer that you wanted, but my point is that the magic still works. The spirit was there, and the spirit has done something. It may not have been exactly what you wanted, but got a reaction. I believe that a lot of the stuff that Lajewski says is correct. I mean, for example, one of the old chestnut says, do you need to be working in a cellar or with your feet on the ground? And the answer is yes and no. If you're calling up sonic spirits, or more likely sonic demons, then being close to the ground and wearing bare feet is a good thing. If you're calling on aerial spirits, then somewhere up high works. I quite often work on a rooftop on the 8th floor, and that works quite well for aerial spirits. And in the Greco-Egyptian texts, they're quite specific. For this spirit, you need to be facing east in the lowest floor of the house, or for that spirit, you need to be on the roof of the house facing in whatever direction, and so forth. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's different places for different spirits.
Yes, and to your point, Dr. Skinner, about how one size doesn't fit all, one of the things you beautifully kind of delineate in techniques of Solomonic magic is kind of the essential things that need to be done regardless of the grimoire. So, for example, you mentioned making sure to cleanse yourself of any human body odor or any smells, and I was reminded of an argument I saw online on one of the forums where someone was arguing with the Goetia, saying, no, you must do a full Key of Solomon purification bath before you do the Goetia. And then the other person was saying, well, no, it doesn't call for that. You just need to make sure that you take some sort of bath and that you don't have any body odors. So is the point, Dr. Skinner, that, of course, if you want to do that and if you will do that with like a full Solomonic bath, that's fantastic. But getting down to the essentials of what actually is needed, it sounds like from that perspective, one of the things is just make sure that there's no human body odor. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yeah, magic in lots of ways is very physical. The thing about breath is important. One of the reasons to fast beforehand is not so you feel spiritual or woozy or anything, but it's to cleanse your body. And then the bath must happen just before the operation. And like you say, if you want to do bells and whistles and use hyssop and go to town, then that's fine. I find that just using some of the same incense on the skin after the bath is pretty effective.
Going back to techniques of Solomonic magic, when you're laying out all the incenses, in the Heptameron for Saturn spirits, one of the incense listed is sulfur, and you say in the notes, quote, not a very practical incense. This is probably a scribal misreading to put sulfur as a Saturn incense. Can you just talk about that in case there's a listener wondering, oh gosh, I hope Dr. Skinner tells me I can burn sulfur in my basement tonight?
No, don't use sulfur. I'll be more emphatic. It's definitely a mistranscription. Sulfur is a very poisonous thing to burn. It puts off sulfur dioxide, and that forms sulfurous acid on the linings of your lungs. So don't do it.
Yeah, I was about to say, please listen to Dr. Skinner, listeners, if you are doing that, because I have seen some conversations in the forums about the use of sulfur. So please don't do that.
This is, just copying from the book and doing that. That's just madness. This is somebody else's anecdote, not mine. But putting abramylin incense, which contains cinnamon and so forth, on your forehead copiously so that it runs into your eyes during an operation is another no-no. You don't need this kind of distraction. Things should not be deleterious to you physically.
That is one of the things that you talk about in techniques of Solomonic magic, which is regardless of the tradition, there are these core things that you are constantly returning to, the properly consecrated phylactery, the timing, the direction, the proper inscription of the circle, that there are certain things that are immutable, and then there might be other things that you shouldn't do, and then other things that you can do, and it can't hurt, and it might It might help, but it's not necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's only after you've had your first successful operation that you can start adding or subtracting. And in fact, I try not to do very much adding and subtracting. If it's working, it's working. Then I'm very happy and I continue to use the same stuff. But then you might then choose to call different spirits or different angels. And so there's an almost endless number of things that you can do with magic.
Dr. Skinner, Joseph Peterson was on the podcast earlier talking about the secrets of Solomon and this kind of Venetian Inquisition grimoire, which reminded me a lot of a Cunning Man's Grimoire, specifically because both a Cunning Man's Grimoire and the Secrets of Solomon seem to be, in many ways, a bridge between, quote-unquote, village or cunning man's magic and quote-unquote high magic. And that might be, as you intimated, a false dichotomy. But I guess, can you just comment on that, whether it's the Secrets of Solomon or a Cunning Man's Grimoire, there are these texts out there that really do bridge the gap, so to speak.
It's a question of how thoroughly you do it. So for Magdalena or some sorceress working in Venice during the time of the Inquisition, you didn't have the facility of a properly laid out temple to return to or to seal and so forth. You sometimes had to do these things on the fly. So the method is simplified because people who are doing it all the time can easily experiment and find out what you can simplify and what you shouldn't simplify. But I wouldn't say it was a bridge. I'd say it was more or less a continuum. For the aristocrat like Summers or Jekyll, who were both senior lawyers, or one guy who was High Lord of the Admiralty, they had rooms that they could seal off and work in, and they could do the whole procedure thoroughly. And that's an ideal that I'm sure some of these cunning men would have liked to have done. But if you've got a neighbor paying you and they want a quick result, then you go for a quick result and you cut a few corners.
I was speaking with Frater Ashen Chassan, and he mentioned that in his kind of angelic and also his goetic work involving spirits, that in many times they've shared or given magical recipes or perceived recipes or wisdom that appears as, quote unquote, cunning man recipes or cunning man advice. Can you just comment on this? Because it seems to kind of support the point you just made about how this is more of a continuum, that there really isn't that, hard of a distinction between these.
You're saying that Ashen Chassan said that he got this information from spirits, yes?
Yes, correct.
That's what I understood, yeah. Well, your magical practice can then expand rapidly because you can find out, you call one up, get it to do things like, for example, one of my longtime friends 30, 40 years ago didn't have access to many grimoires, called up a spirit and said, I want access to a large number of grimoires. And then things converged and people gave him, sold him, catalogue, suddenly he had a huge number of grimoires. So you can expand your practice that way, or you can just ask the spirit, what is it that I've done that you don't like? How can I better call you? How can I call the king that rules over you? And things like that. And you will get information back. And it may come audibly, or it may come in a dream afterwards. Sometimes you get a high clarity dream afterwards with details of method and things, which is quite useful. So it's an enormous field. You can start at one edge of it, and I've still got an awfully long way to go. That's half the fun.
I think the analogy of a car or learning how to drive a car might work for some of the listeners out there. Certainly works for me, where you can spend 25 years reading about how to drive a car and reading the car manual, and you can know all the gears and all the shifting and, going fast, going slow, the brakes. But it's only when you get in a car and actually start actively driving and moving with the flow of traffic and braking that you pick up what's actually involved.
Yes, and I think everybody's first pull into traffic is very freaky. Certainly when I was learning to drive, the first time I pulled into traffic, there's all these people driving past me. I didn't learn in a field or in a back parking lot or something, but I learned in town. And I thought, shit, this is not easy. But I had a good instructress, and so I learned to drive. But Yes, if you don't learn to drive, you just buy the car, or you buy all the tools and the equipment and the incense, and you paint the circle and you do all that. And you've got to start one day. You've got to actually turn the engine on. You've got to figure out how to turn the engine on too. And one of the things that is difficult, magic is difficult to learn from the book. Car driving, well, okay, you turn the key, and then what do you do, etc., etc. Magic is at least as complicated as that. You should do it, yeah.
In A Cunning Man's Grimoire, Dr. Skinner, as you mentioned, there's a lot of different things with astrological magic and things that is, as you delineated, separate from the Solomonic techniques. There's also so many experiments, multiple experiments, I should say, involving a crystal and a crystal glass. And I'm thinking of, Rudd's 9 angelic keys, of course, thinking of John Dee, thinking of the Almadel, for example, found in the Lemegeton. Can you just comment on any thoughts that come to mind regarding the incorporation of crystals in a grimoire that also has astrological magic and the Heptamer?
Yeah, and crystals are good for scrying, and I can't say I'm particularly good as a scryer, but you can contact spirits using the crystal. And then people ask, well, where do you put the crystal? Inside the circle, outside the circle, whatever. What you see in the crystal is an image, not the actual spirit. What you see in the triangle outside the circle is the actual spirit. So there's the difference. People like Fred Hockley spent huge numbers of hours with a scryer. He didn't see himself in the crystal. John Dee alleged only to have seen in the crystal once or twice. The rest of the time he had Kelly or Bartholomew Hickman scrying for him. I believe that Frater Chassan also has a scryer, and I can confirm that I do also have a scryer. It's very strange, but the temperament that makes a good magician does not seem to make a good scryer, and I have no idea why.
Well, that is interesting. And to your point, just to make sure that I'm getting this right, even though a magician may not have a immediately natural aptitude for scrying, a magician going solo and practicing and engaging with early operations alone can still have a very successful evocation without a scryer, correct?
Yeah, I can confirm that I've actually seen the spirits outside the circle on a number of occasions. But inside the tiny little crystal or the glass globe, not very often.
One of the things that people have commented on after our first talk was when you were talking about the size of the circle, whether that's a 9-foot radius or a 9-foot diameter. And one of the things you mentioned was that you didn't see any particular significance in the number 9 or any kind of, Kabbalistic interest. That really, it's just for convenience. I guess my question is, in your experience, is that the same for the size of the crystal? Does it really matter if the crystal is, 4 inches long versus like the Tritemius drawing spirits into crystals? It should be the size of a tangerine. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think the size of a tangerine is a pretty good size. You can have a much larger crystal, but there's no real point. People can scry in crystals small enough to set on a ring. Some Jewish charming practices which you just scry in a thumbnail which has been anointed. I've never had any success with any of those. So size really doesn't matter, but I think something around about the size of an orange or a tangerine is pretty much ideal, because then you can actually come to terms with it much easier than a tiny little crystal. I
know there are listeners out there, Dr. Skinner, right now saying, okay, well, if Dr. Skinner can have success just by himself without a scryer, why use a scryer? Is it just so that you can focus more as the magician, as the operator, on the operation? Does it help?
Yes. If you're evoking, you've got to do a number of things. You've got, first of all, you should not read the invocations. Okay? I've been in invocations where people have successfully read the invocation and it worked, so I can't rule that out completely. But it should be fluid. You should be able to just say it almost without paying any attention. Well, you should pay attention, but it should come easily and naturally. You can't be doing that and looking outside the circle and or using the sword or whatever and scry at the same time. You just can't do it. So it's much better if somebody is looking in the crystal or whatever, scrying while you're doing the invocation. And if they're a trained scry, they'll get much more information than you would, because you're busy thinking, what is the next thing I've got to do? Is the incense topped up properly? Is XYZ facing in the right direction? The scry, however, can just concentrate on, what can I hear the Spirit saying? Is the Spirit really saying that, Or is that my imagination? Things like that. So it's specialization. I mean, it's always good to have somebody else in the circle. You can do it solo, but it's useful to have somebody else there.
Now, to that point, Dr. Skinner, obviously a magician of your experience, having a scryer, someone like Frater Chassan, that makes total sense. What do you think about when Dr. Lasuski, for example, one of his axioms, of course, is, especially when you're starting out, always work alone. Do not involve other people. Do not involve multiple people, but always work alone, at least when you're starting out. Is that something you'd recommend to a fledgling magician?
Well, I think on the basis that it's very hard to find somebody who is going to be on the same level as you, or, whatever level that might be. You've got to have somebody who is not skeptical, not sitting there thinking, this is a load of rubbish, or somebody who's having fantasies or something like that. It's just hard to find somebody. I don't think you should work necessarily alone, but you should find somebody who's compatible. I used to work with a group of 4 people, which requires a slightly bigger circle than ones we've been talking about, otherwise you bump into everybody else. And that worked quite well. One was a scryer, 2 more were there looking around to see where manifestation might happen, taking turns to read the invocations, because sometimes you can build up a rhythm, like if the main invoker, the main castist, reads the invocation, then the number 2 man reads it again, and the number 3 man reads it again, and then you go back to the main castist again, and that works very well. But if you've got to sit there and read the full invocation 3 times, boredom will set in, or other distractions. 4 is pretty much an ideal combination. But to find 3 other people who have the same attitude to magic is very difficult to do.
I just recently told someone that you said the following in the podcast, and I haven't listened back, so I need to make sure, but someone was asking about planetary hours, and I mentioned, well, Dr. Skinner shared on the podcast that you need to be prepared, initially at least, for hours of work, and that it's okay if you start in a planetary hour, day and hour of Saturn, for example, but if it goes into the hour of Jupiter, that's okay as long as you start in the planetary hour, and you might be standing up for hours initially doing this work. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, ideally, you should be able to fit it in the same hour, but if you overlap into the next hour, that's not terrible. Obviously, there's some combinations you might not wish to overlap into a Saturnian hour if you're doing Jupiterian or Venusian, but you can work this out by looking at the table of hours. The other key with the hours is that in any day, the very first hour, that is immediately after the sun rises, is the planet that corresponds to the planet of that day. And in Greco-Egyptian magic, that was usually considered the best time. And certainly from no interruptions and things, just after dawn is a very good, clear time to work. The next hour, if you miss that, is the 8th hour, because you do the full cycle of 7, and then the 8th hour, and then the 15th hour, 7 hours after that, etc. So you get 3 possibilities in any day to work, but the very first one is the very best one.
Yes, and I remember you mentioned on the podcast before about how another good reason is because the first hour of the day, it's very quiet. There's not usually a lot of commotion. If you're hopefully isolated in a natural environment, there probably isn't a lot going on in terms of things that can distract. So it just seems like that's just the best hour for a variety of reasons.
It's not just your distraction, but it's the spirits. The spirits do not like lots of noise and lots of people around. This is why most of the grimoires say, some isolated hamlet somewhere or some room furthest away from the noise in the streets. I know a lot of people try to do this in their lounge room or whatever and put it up temporarily and so forth, but that is definitely not ideal. Not everybody has the chance to go away to the country and do it in a clearing in the woods, but that's one possibility. Otherwise, a dedicated room is very helpful.
Oh, yeah. I remember John King was mentioning as well, and I think you definitely agree with this, that any location he's ever chose to live has always factored in being in a kind of environment that's appropriate for the spirits, whether that's out west in the desert or whether that's in just an isolated environment to preserve that.
Yeah, spirits are like wild animals. They don't like masses of humans. They don't like heavy traffic. They don't like noise. They don't like smells. So if you do under those circumstances, then you're pushing it uphill. It's that much harder. Once you get the hang of it, then it can be done. But when you're starting out, it's better to arrange everything so that it's optimum.
To that point, Dr. Skinner, something that you mentioned, gosh, I think this was back in the Goetia of Dr. Rudd, but you mentioned that, there's this debate. Do you use, a triangle of the art? Can you use a crystal on the table of practice? And as you said, the crystal inside the circle is merely an image, not the spirit. But it sounds like it's appropriate to use both. You can have a triangle of art and the crystal. Is that, from your experience, something that's acceptable?
Yeah, if you have a scryer, then obviously sitting her or him in front of the crystal on a table of art would be a good way to do it. And yes, if you have a triangle outside of the circle and you're evoking into the triangle, you may get lucky and get both the image in the crystal and the external manifestation. Either is fine.
A Cunning Man's Grimoire obviously is available through Golden Horde. It is a fantastic menagerie of different samplings of various magical traditions. And is there anything else about A Cunning Man's Grimoire, Dr. Skinner, that we didn't cover that you just like the listeners to know about?
Yeah, some of the operations towards the end, like how to make a castle appear or an elephant appear in your room, well, they don't work. They are rather too limited and cut down, and you need to expand them to make it work. The names of the spirits might be useful, though. Well, the other thing I would say is don't do it like the Cunning Man's Grimoire. Do not throw everything in bits and pieces. I mean, it's there, it's historically interesting because it's got all these bits and pieces in it. But if you're interested in doing magic practically, then just take a more purist approach. Either do the talismanic Arabian way or do the Solomonic Greek and Egyptian way. And in the latter, I would include the Heptamer.
Dr. Skinner, as we wrap up this episode, I'd just like to ask you a few listener questions that came through as well. We have a questioner who had a series for you. One of the listeners to the Glitch Bottle podcast is asking, does Dr. Skinner regularly practice meditation of any kind, such as the Hermetic methods? Any response to that, Dr. Skinner?
Yes, I do meditate, but it's not connected with my magical practice.
The same questioner is asking, how necessary are tools for successful magical operation? Initially,
very necessary. As you progress and as you bind particular spirits, you can use less and less in the way of tools. But magic is not airy-fairy. It is physical, and you should start with the right tools at the beginning. It's no good to sit in a darkened room and imagine a circle and imagine a sword and imagine incense, or actually burn incense. That doesn't cut the mustard. You need the tools initially because that's what the method's based on. If you're doing talismanic magic, then you need talismans. If you're doing Solomonic magic, you need circles and tools.
Absolutely. And to that point, Dr. Skinner, the questioner is saying, do you enter into any type of altered state of consciousness when evoking to appearance? And I'm thinking here of Dr. Lasuski, who says during the operation, there's this kind of tension, magical tension that builds up. One attains a state of ecstasy, and then there's divine energy that's felt. I guess, do you enter any specific altered state of consciousness?
Certainly magical tension has to build up because the achievement of the objective is when it's discharged. But no, I don't wish to enter trance or ecstasy because I wish to be in control of the situation. The scribe perhaps needs to be in trance to get the full message, but the castist, the magician, needs to be in control of things, and that means keeping his eye on what's happening outside the circle, keeping the pace of the ritual going, and making sure that the right incense is burning and things like that.
Absolutely. I think listeners will find that very valuable. And the questioner is also asking, do governments and higher-ups know about this technology? I don't know if you have any comment on that. I remember during another podcast you mentioned, you were asked about, well, did the former prime minister have someone who was more new agey? Or, I guess, what are your thoughts?
Okay, well, there's a number of things there. First of all, I'm not in government, so I can't really tell you what the high-ups in government think about, if they think about it at all. In the West, everybody is primarily a materialist, so I wouldn't have thought there were too many people thinking about it. The CIA and the Russian intelligence are reputed to have experimented with various methods of clairvoyance and distant seeing. With full-scale magic, I don't think so. However, outside of the Western world, I can tell you that one of the African states sent a delegation to London to speak to, one of them was Alexander, another one was me, to see if either of us would be happy to go down and live there and train their local magicians. We both declined, but they were certainly very serious about it. At the other side of the world, I can tell you that some of the politicians in Asia definitely retain magicians, or if it's Malaysia, they retain bomos to work for them. And I have no comment on their success or otherwise, but some of the fees charged are quite high.
I think you mentioned, too, this might have been feng shui, but I think you mentioned in a previous podcast that there are many casino owners in Asia who use specific energies to make sure the money stays in the casino as opposed to leaving.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about feng shui in the West, you just get a sort of look which says, oh, yeah, that's interior decorating, which it's not. It's much more complicated than that. All of the big casinos, and I can tell you every one of the casinos that I've come across, one in Melbourne, one in Sydney, one in Auckland, those near Hong Kong, all retain feng shui masters to make sure that the luck is in the favor of the casino and not the people who come in. And it's a special form of feng shui that makes sure that the money and the people come, but only the people leave, and mostly they leave the money behind. And the fees for that kind of feng shui advice are quite high and well earned, because if that's done properly, then the casino figures to earn a lot more money than they would have otherwise done so.
Dr. Skinner, the questioner also asks a question, and kind of a theme that you've touched on many times, is asking how fractured is current magical knowledge, and is it still necessary to have an adept guide and advise you, given that there are so many esoteric books that are publicly available?
Well, yeah, the books that are available are a mixed bunch. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. We were talking earlier about driving, learning to drive, and it's a bit like that. If you have somebody sitting beside you and telling you, now is the time to pull out, now is not the time to pull out, hit the brakes and so forth, that's very helpful. So learning magic from books is a bit difficult, and it was always helpful to have somebody who has done it before alongside you to give you the clues, stop you doing something you shouldn't do, and make sure that you do the things that you should do. But it's not essential. I know a number of magicians who have successfully started their practice from books and moved on from there. Once you have contact with the spirits, you can derive information from them. Then you don't necessarily have to go back to the books after that.
And I can tell the listeners that if you do have someone who is a legitimate practitioner who's willing to point you in the right direction, that is, be thankful for sure. The questioner is also asking, if someone were to display a magical circle via a projector or an LCD display, does it make it ineffectual? And you kind of touched on this earlier. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, just a projected image is not going to cut the mustard. You have to at the very least pass over the blade of a knife or a sword. I prefer to see something that's firmly painted on either on the floor or on the floor cloth, or even on a canvas. I have a couple of circles painted on canvas which work quite well, can be folded up later. I think projecting it is not going to work, but I can't say for sure because I've never tried projecting it. It just doesn't sound as if it's going to be as effective. No, I think you can make shortcuts afterwards when you know that it's working, but if you start by making shortcuts to start with and then it doesn't work, where do you go from there? Make sure do it properly to start with. Get it working, talk to the spirits, and then you can start to think about how you can shortcut. But by that time, of course, you will have painted your circle, so you won't need to project it.
One of the last listener questions we have is, can technology be used with evocation and magic? And I don't know if they mean setting up a video camera or recording the operation, which I know you mentioned sometimes recorders often fail. What are your thoughts, Dr. Skinner, on can technology be used with evocation?
It's a tempting thought that you could pre-record the operation and put the thing on a continuous loop. I've experimented with doing that because that is a very tempting thought, and it didn't work for me. That doesn't mean it won't work for you. I've also found that technology fails frequently in a ritual environment. I've had several people attempted to set up a video of a magical operation, and they had endless problems with the camera and the electrics. At a much lower level, I've attempted to record scrying, even just something simple like a scrying session on an old-fashioned tape recorder, and had it fail or just come out blank. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but it seems to be difficult.
I think the listeners will appreciate that answer, especially as they muse over things in the online forums and elsewhere, always looking for different ways to do things. Dr. Skinner, thank you so much for taking the time and coming back on the Glitch Bottle podcast.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Wow, that was so inspiring and informative. And listeners, I think you'd agree with me that it's always a rare treat to hear from Dr. Stephen Skinner, and I seriously hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I swear I always learn something new personally, either to apply or to tweak or think about every time I re-listen. So thanks as always goes directly to you, the listeners, for kicking butt and sharing your time to enjoy the podcast. In the meantime, you can definitely subscribe and check out previous episodes and other magical Glitch Bottle news on YouTube. That's youtube.com/glitchbottle. And you can also download and listen to podcast episodes of the Glitch Bottle podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. Please also make sure to subscribe and follow us on YouTube. And if you subscribe, hit that little notification bell for new episodes as soon as they post. And you can always follow us on Twitter at GlitchBottle. Our music intro is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.